You walk into the room before anyone else arrives. Before you've said a word, you can feel it. Someone's anxiety about the quarter, the tension from a conversation that hasn't happened yet, the angst within your team. And without being asked, without even consciously deciding to, you absorb it. You adjust, you regulate so that everyone else can function. And that happens before the first agenda item has been addressed. Most of the leaders that I've been working with have been doing this for years. They've been absorbing the room, holding space, staying regulated so everyone else feels safe. And almost none of them have had anyone name the cost of doing that. Today, I want to name it. There's a kind of leader who is everywhere but nowhere at the same time. They show up, they are present, they are available. The team sees them. They are reliable, steady, and composed, even relatable. But internally and privately, they are running on empty. They're not in crisis, they are not failing. And this isn't necessarily seen by the people around them. They're just in this holding pattern, holding everything steady. If that's you, I want you to know something before we go further in this conversation. It's not something that a better morning routine can fix or a new framework or strategy. What you're experiencing has a name. It's a biological mechanism, and it's been accumulating in your space longer than you might probably realize. In 1983, a sociologist called Arlie Hochschild published a book called The Managed Heart. And she'd been studying flight attendants and debt collectors over a period of time. And she was trying to understand something that no one had necessarily named before. Her definition was clear and simple. It was the management of feeling to create a publicly observable display. In other words, the work in making sure that the outside matches what the situation requires versus what's actually happening in the inside. And she identified two ways in which people do this. The first is surface acting. So you pretend that you have the right feeling, you adjust your tone, your body, your movements, and you don't feel any shift take place. The second is deep acting. You go deeper. You actually end up conjuring the feeling itself. You make yourself feel steady, and so you generate this state within yourself. And here is what Hochschild found. Surface acting, essentially, you get really good at building up this persona and this mask, but you actually detach yourself from your feelings. So you're ending up losing the ability to attune to what you actually feel underneath the mask that you're wearing. The deep acting, on the other hand, well, that erodes something else completely. Your feelings become instruments of your role. These are just things that you start generating on demand. So tools for your leadership, tools for your role, tools that end up being instruments at your beck and call. And it essentially stops feeling like yours. And so she called this the double bind between self-alienation and inauthenticity. And for leaders, well, the stakes are higher than for anyone else that she studied. A flight attendant's shift ends. Yours doesn't. I want to show you what's actually happening in your nervous system every time you hold a room. Because at the end of the day, this isn't metaphorical, this is biological. Stephen Porges developed what is called polyvagal theory. And it maps out how the nervous system responds to social and environmental cues. So when you are the regulatory anchor of a specific room, the person whose nervous system that everyone else attunes themselves to, they are essentially having to co-regulate against that person. In this case, you. Here is what's happening underneath that composure that you are expressing. So your ventral vagal complex is continuously activated. It's broadcasting safety through your face, through your voice, through your posture. And at the same time, it's suppressing your own defensive states. So your own anxiety and your own activation gets suppressed. So while you're doing that, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for your decision making and your strategy and your creative thinking, that is trying to suppress your amygdala to keep a threat response from surfacing whilst you are acting as that anchor in the room. And this is metabolically expensive. So over time, with insufficient recovery, this stress response system begins to dysregulate. And so the cortisol levels in your system stay elevated, and that amygdala, which should be kept in check, is no longer kept in check. And your prefrontal cortex tires because you actually don't have enough capacity to maintain it. And everything becomes hyperactive. The brain's own regulatory architecture begins to fail. And everything begins to break down from there. And here's something that neuroscience shows. So with chronic unrecovered activation, gray matter in the prefrontal cortex actually begins to thin over time. The structure is responsible for your presence, your decision quality, and your emotional flexibility, and it physically degrades. And again, this is why we're saying this is not necessarily a weakness, it is just biology. It is just a physical function of your system. The nervous system has been doing expensive biological work with insufficient recovery, and there is this unpaid bill that tends to always arrive consistently. So let me describe to you what this looks like in practice. So you arrive home after a long day. You've been on since 5 a.m. You have held the team through an uncertain quarter. You've had to make decisions. You've micromanaged. You've absorbed anxiety, different pressures, and you even had to stay regulated when the situation wasn't. And then your youngest child comes into the room and wants to show you something that they've built. And they're so proud of what they've been able to achieve in their little pocket of their day. And there's a moment where you feel it's a flicker of frustration before the love comes in, before you're able to really connect and disconnect from the day that you've just had. And that frustration isn't about them. It's this residue that is built up throughout the day, throughout the weeks, throughout the months, where you've had to absorb everyone else's stress. And now it's finally finding a space to land. And so the people you work with gets the best of you, and the people who love you get what's left. And I see this pattern in almost every high-capacity leader that I work with. The emotional availability at work is real and it is sustained, it is felt, it is seen. And the emotional availability at home, it's not nothing, but it's what's left over. And this is what makes it even harder. The research on team dynamics shows that this can cascade both ways. A 2024 study of 372 team members and 62 managers mapped exactly what happens when a leader is emotionally exhausted. The leader withdraws, not dramatically but subtly. They become present but absent, available in the calendar but not in the room. The team detects it, and the research shows that what falls first is psychological safety. People stop speaking up. They stop raising concerns. They stop asking questions. And from there, innovation slows, communication closes, and the team itself stops adapting. And the leader's internal state is the key differentiator. It is the most upstream variable in whether the team functions optimally or not. And Amy Edmondson has spent decades studying psychological safety. And to put it simply, if the employees don't speak up, we can almost always assume that the leader has not created a psychologically safe environment. And you cannot create psychological safety from a state or space of depletion. And I want to make a distinction that I think most leadership content gets wrong. There are two different kinds of depletion, and they have two causes and two very different solutions. So most people know burnout. It comes from doing too much without sufficient time or resources. It builds gradually, and you can make meaningful progress by reducing load and essentially adding in space for recovery. But there's something else that I call compassion fatigue, and this is slightly different. Compassion fatigue is not caused by doing too much. It is caused by giving too much without receiving in return. So Professor Paul Gilbert has spent decades studying this and describes it as compassion neglect. The leader is expending an enormous amount of biological energy while their own well-being goes unsupported. And doesn't that sound familiar? The symptoms are different, and it's not primarily exhaustion. It's, one way to put it is the erosion of capacity to care for oneself. And here's a couple of things that you might be familiar with. There's an emotional attachment that may arise within your team members. And here's a couple of things that tend to occur when this arises. You experience emotional detachment from your team members, and it's very subtle. You notice that there's more cynicism, not necessarily towards the work, but towards the vision and towards your colleagues, partners, team members. There's a definitive decrease in patience, and you notice that you want to react instead of respond, and you just don't, that fuse is exceptionally short. And there's this feeling that you might be just going through the motions with the people that are nearest and dearest to you. And so there's a complete lack of presence. And critically, the solution looks different. Burnout recovers with rest. Compassion fatigue recovers when the leader begins to receive and not just give. And most leadership advice addresses the first, but ignores the second completely. So I want to share with you what recovery actually looks like. Because I think most leaders have a version of recovery that is really just a pause, and a forced pause, I might add. Peter Levine spent decades studying how the nervous system processes stress, and his core finding was this: stress is not a psychological event, it is a physiological one. When the nervous system mobilizes survival energy, which is exactly what happens every time you absorb a room and stay composed under pressure, the energy needs somewhere to go. In animals, it discharges automatically, and after the threat passes, they shake, tremble, pant. The stress cycle in and of itself completes. The nervous system is then able to return to baseline. In leaders, however, the energy mobilizes but cannot discharge. The professional context demands composure. The survival energy is essentially suppressed, compartmentalized, and one's having to push through it. And so this energy stores in the body. So it's seen as chronic muscle tension, hypervigilance, or even disturbed sleep. And more common than not, the inability to switch off even when nothing is happening. And here is the critical thing. Each subsequent stressor adds to the existing load rather than processing through it. It's very important to keep in mind. So most leaders think of recovery as going on holiday, and the holiday doesn't refresh. The weekend disappears into this low-grade anxiety because the week is about to start again. And it's essentially a way to visualize this. It's as if you have paused on top of all the stored energy that is yet to be processed, and you have yet to discharge it. Rest is not the same as recovery. Real recovery means that you have to complete the stress cycle. And it's physical. It's not just this cognitive thing that you mentally process. It's happening in the body, not just in the mind. And I've noticed that the leaders that are able to sustain a certain level of performance are not just pushing through this. They have found a way to let go of this stored charge in their system. So they have more capacity, and in turn, they're capable of managing what lands on their desk on a day-to-day basis. So I want to come back to the room, the one you walked into before anyone else arrived, the absorption that happened before that first agenda item, the regulation that you provided others so that they could function, the holding that will happen again tomorrow and the day after that, and every other day that you have to lead. None of this is wrong, and in fact, some of this is exactly right. The capacity to hold the room, to regulate under pressure, to hold a vision, to be patient, to be the one that others orient themselves around. That is genuine strength. But strength and sustainability are different things. And the question that I want to leave you with is not, how do I stop carrying this? It's, has any of this ever been named, measured, or addressed? Or have I simply called it leadership and just kept moving forward? Because the leaders who I work with, who are genuinely sustainable, are not the ones who carry less. They're the ones that finally understand what they are carrying, and they build a structure that can hold some of it for them. And the most depleted leaders are not the ones that are doing the most. They're the ones holding the most, without anyone holding anything for them. If this landed, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're curious and want to dive deeper into yourself, check out the capacity assessment at frequencycoaching.com/assessment, where you can take a 3-minute diagnostic to see where you're leaking power and capacity. Leading takes courage. Leading takes perseverance. Leading takes the ability to discern through uncertainty and really trust your gut and to recognize patterns. There's just so many nuances and there is so much noise out there today. But if you're choosing to play the game and you're choosing to play it at a level where you are competitive, not just with other people, but with the highest expression of yourself, something that I've come to know later rather than sooner is that you cannot play this game on your own. All of us do not have the ability to see all our blind spots and to maintain a true north. I want to acknowledge the fact that you took a moment to pour into yourself today and just recognize that leadership requires courage, persistence, discernment, and strength. And it's so much easier nowadays to compartmentalize ourselves and want to lone wolf this idea of foundership, leadership, stewardship. Again, trust and know that you have the ability to make the shift. See you in the next one.